So, welcome to the webinar, guys. My name is Martin Casserell. I'm the moderator for this session. Great session on managing both on-premise and Azure databases with PowerShell by a great speaker, Alan White, who spoke at the SQL Pass Summit pretty much every year since 2006. So, moving on. If anyone requires any technical assistance during this presentation, just type in the message box. I'll try and get you sorted out, or maybe just leave the session, come back in. Hopefully everything will be fine, but if there isn't, just type a message. So we'll move on. I'd like to thank our sponsors for this session, Microsoft and Dell Software. Obviously Azure, Microsoft product that Alan will be talking about today. And without these sponsors, obviously this event couldn't happen. Moving on again. Pass Summit is coming up very shortly. 2014, I think it's in its 14th or 15th year this year. 190 sessions over 5 tracks, and there'll be people there from 52 countries. So a great chance to network. So we'll move on. Right, so now the speaker, Alan White. He's been speaking at the Pass Summit since 2006. He's shortly speaking at SQL Connections, and then it'll also be at the Summit. And I've just found out that one of the things that Alan's done recently is sing with the Cleveland Orchestra. Pretty good achievement there, Alan. So, you obviously got a good voice ready for us, so I'll hand over to you, and looking forward to this, mate. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Martin. I appreciate it. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about managing both your on-premise and your Azure databases with PowerShell. I'm a practice leader at Upsearch, SQL Server Consulting Practice. You can reach me via this email address or follow me on Twitter at SQLRunner, R-U-N-R. So I am a practice leader at Upsearch. So we've been doing this for about 5 years now, but I have been in IT for 40 years as of August. So I've seen a lot of changes in that time. I started using Sybase in 1992 and Microsoft SQL Server in 1995. And it's now been 8 years that I've been awarded the Microsoft MVP award. It's really an honor, and I thank Microsoft for the privilege of being part of this program. So take a look at the program for yourself if you're at all interested. We're going to talk first about remoting. Now, I'm not talking about remote desktop. I'm talking about PowerShell remoting. It gives you access to your machines across the network remotely as though you were sitting at them. You can retrieve data, you can execute code, and it's not just a single computer at a time like you have with remote desktop. You can issue commands that will execute against multiple computers if you so choose. And it's very, very lightweight. It's like I said before, it's like a command line version of a remote desktop, but it uses the special protocol for the Windows Server management called, it's an HTTP protocol that's built into the WinRM architecture. Now, every server that Microsoft has released since Windows Server 2012 has the WinRM automatically enabled, so you don't have to do anything special. You will have to enable it with older servers, but I strongly recommend you move up to the latest and greatest versions of the servers. As we move towards the more modern servers, PowerShell's implementation in each server operating system gets more and more robust, and so I recommend you do this. The remoting connects to the server's WinRM service. When you connect to that server, you're running PowerShell on your local machine. Your connection is actually running an executable called WSM PROV host. And if you look at a process list of processes. Use the get process cmdlet. If someone's remoted in, you'll see WSM PROV host.exe for any remoting sessions that come in. One of the things that I want to mention, and usually I do this in a room when I'm presenting live, and I ask for a show of hands of how many people use remote desktop to manage their servers, and most of the people raise their hand because that's generally how we do things. And unfortunately, what we're doing is we're seriously impacting the performance of our server by getting into a GUI interface to do the kinds of things that we need to get done. So with remoting, we don't have that heavy GUI impact on the server. The other thing that comes into play with remoting is, when you're in remote desktop, I'll bet you most of you have run into the 2-person limit that you have with remote desktop. Only 2 people can log into that server at a single time to get any work done. And that's frustrating at times. How's that? It's just very frustrating. With PowerShell remoting, you do not have the 2-person limit. If you have 3 or 4 people that need to work on that server at the same time, for whatever reason, it's possible. Just as for a real quick visualization, we've got your computer over here is running PowerShell. It's using the WSMan protocol, connects to an HTTP endpoint over on the server, and it fires up WSM PROV host. Now, how do we actually use remoting when we're in a PowerShell session? We can create an ad hoc session with the enter PS session cmdlet, and we can either use a computer name or a connection URI to connect to the server. We'll also use enter PS session if we've already established a persistent session to get into that session. When we're done with that session, we use exit PS session to get out. If we just want to run a command against a single server or multiple servers, we'll use invoke command, and we'll pass either a script block containing the code that we want to execute on the remote server, or we can send a file path. We can specify a file path, and it will execute the script that's identified in that file path. We'll show this to you in a demo in a minute. We can also use, as I mentioned before, a persistent session, because sometimes we have some work to do, we're going to save our state, come back to it later. And so we instantiate a new PowerShell session, put that session information in a variable, and then we use enter PS session with that variable to go into that session, exit PS session, we're back out. When we're finally done, we say remove PS session with that variable, and it cleans up after itself, and we're done. So let's take a look at PowerShell remoting. I've got a domain here with the domain controller, and I'm on a Windows 8.1 client here, and I've got 2 SQL servers, 2 servers running SQL Server, I think it's 2014, on Windows Server Core. So we're going to go into the first one here, WS12 SQL 01, and this is an ad hoc session. And you notice at the left-hand side of the prompt, it gives us the name of the server we're connected to, and then it points us to our default directory. One of the things I can do when I log into a remote server is I can load in the SQL PS module with the disable name checking option. And the reason we use disable name checking option is because there is a list of approved verbs that the PowerShell team approved starting with PowerShell 2.0, so that they avoid things like using kill and terminate and destroy, all to do the same thing. They wanted a consistent verb for that process. So they came up with a list of consistent verbs, but they did not include things like backup and restore, which as DBAs we all know we're going to use backup and restore rather regularly. So now what I've done is I've loaded up the SQL Server environment into my PowerShell session, and when I do that, it lands me in the SQL Server provider. I can now change directory or set location. I'll use the proper set location to SQL WS12 SQL 01 default. And it's going slower than I expected, but we should be going to this directory. Not sure why it's taking so long. Oh, there it goes. It just took a little longer than I expected. Sorry. What I can do now is I can say get, I'm going to set a variable called server. I'm going to set that to get item and dot. Dot says get the item that's defined at my current location. In this case, my current location is the default instance of SQL Server on my server. I could then set a variable called bdir equals svr.backup directory. I'm still here in the default directory, which is pointing to the instance of SQL Server. If I set location to $bdir, I'm now in the directory where the backups go by default. And if I look there, you see I have a couple of backups, including one from, well, it's still 9/9 here, so a little earlier in the evening I took a backup of the Northwind database. So it's a real quick way for you to navigate just by knowing how to navigate through the SQL Server provider within PowerShell. I'm done with that. I've seen everything I want to see, so I'm going to go ahead and exit PS session. So for all that time, I was working remotely on that server, WS12 SQL 01, as though I were logged in through remote desktop. I was able to see what I needed to see, and I got back out. Again, much more lightweight than what you have with remote desktop. I want to get a quick look at that server to see what is taking the topmost amount of memory. So I've got a script here that uses the get process commandlet, sorts the results in descending order by the amount of memory they take, and then pipes that to a select object and selects just the first 10. And you see here I can see that SQL Server is the topmost memory consuming process on the system, and right after that is my remote PowerShell session that I was just in. By the way, I could do this against multiple computers at the same time just by adding the computers in a comma-separated list. There's the list from 1, and then there's the list from 2. If I want to see what my disk space looks like at a glance, I can select from Win32 logical disk where drive type equals 3 on the remote server, And in this case, I only have one drive, and it gives me the free space and size in bytes. So I can get a quick look to see if I'm doing okay on disk space. I've got here a script that says, bring me back information on my databases on that server. And it gives me the basic properties. So here I can look through, and I can see all of my databases, the size, the space available, some of their properties like compatibility level, auto shrink, etc. All of this stuff comes back very quickly, and again, I can run this against multiple servers at the same time. I've got another script here that brings back just the errors from the error log. And you can see earlier I had a case where I had a login failure for the administrative account that I log in. Why? Because I was trying to open up a database called Fred. If you run this against multiple servers, you can get a quick look to see what kind of errors you have in your error log. And this particular script only brings back errors, so I don't have to weed through the mountains of information on the number of backups that were taken. This script focuses on just the errors. So that's a computer in my domain. So the logged in account that I have is, of course, the test domain administrator. That's all well and good, but what if I'm trying to connect to a computer that's not in my domain? Well, in this case, I'm going to use enter PS session, and I'm going to specify the IP address, and I'm going to pass it my credential that I can use on that system. And it prompts up and asks me for a password. And I get an error. The error says connecting to remote server failed because the WinRM client can't process the results. And you notice it says we need to add the destination to the trusted hosts list. So let's do that. We're going to set item. The path is wsman localhost client trusted hosts, and I'm going to add the IP address for that server. It's going to tell me it modifies the trusted host list. Yep, that's what I wanted to do. We've accomplished that, and now I can enter PS session again. Password didn't change, but here I am now in that server. These are just some of the files that are in the root directory on the C drive on that server. And when I'm done, of course, exit PS session. If I'm going to be going in and out of that server on a regular basis, though, what I want to do is I want to use new PS session. Again, it's going to ask for my password, and now I can enter that PS session at any time. Program files, Microsoft SQL Server, Instance 01, oh, and here are the binaries for that instance of SQL Server. If I wanted to take a look at the data files themselves, I'd have to go over to the E drive because that's where I put them. And there are the data files on that instance of SQL Server. When I'm done, I exit PS session. I can re-enter that PS session, and it's still right where I was before. It kept mind of where I physically was, so I didn't have to go back and re-navigate to the directory I wanted to work in. And when I'm done, finally, I exit PS session and remove the session. Now, one thing I'm going to do just to save myself a whole lot of aggravation every time I run invoke command is I'm going to use the get credential commandlet and pass it the credential of the login account. Now that credential is in the variable called cred, so I can run the scripts I was running before, top memory process. Now there's the top memory processes on that server that's not in my domain. So you can see we've got 2 instances of SQL Server running there, and then of course SSMS takes some memory as well. I can do the same thing with the disk space. Here I have 3 drives. I've got the C drive, the E drive is my data drive, and the F drive is my log drive, and I get information on the space on each of those drives. I'm going to look for the databases available on those servers, and here they are, just like we talked about earlier. You notice I passed in the argument with the instance, the server and instance name, the full instance name for SQL Server. I needed to pass that in so it knew which of the 2 servers I wanted information about. And lastly, getting the log information. Again, I attempted to open a database Fred as the administrator account. The administrator account is valid, but because I specifically asked to open the database Fred, it said, hey, I can't do that. So by a scan error log, it lets me look to see what kind of errors are going on. Martin, any questions to this point?
No questions at this point, Alan. You're doing great, though.
Okay, great. Thanks.
I'll give you a shout if any questions come through.
All right, super. All right, so let's talk about Windows Azure Virtual Machines. This is infrastructure as a service. So if you're already moving your servers to virtualized machines, as most of us are, in fact, I'm in Palo Alto, California right now as part of a 3-day seminar that VMware is putting on for us to help a group of SQL Server experts learn how best to configure both VMware and SQL Server for the best performance. That's infrastructure, and the cloud environment, Windows Azure Virtual Machines, are simply virtual machines. Instead of on a virtual host in your data center, they're on a virtual host in Microsoft's data center. So it's just a virtual machine on a cloud server, and there's really no difference. So it's nothing magic, and it all works great. The first thing, of course, you got to do is you got to go to azure.microsoft.com and set up an account. Then the next thing you'll want to do after that is go to the link that I'm providing here, and we've got a link at the end of this deck to show you where you can go, where you can download the deck and the script that I'm running through in my demos. But you want to download and install the PowerShell Azure modules to be able to do the things that we're doing in this session. If you miss the link for the deck, you can also go to my articles on SQLmag.com. I wrote a series of articles on getting started with Windows Azure VMs there, and it has the same information. So once you have installed those PowerShell Azure modules and restarted your PowerShell session, you use a commandlet called set Azure subscription, specifying your subscription name and ID in those values. You can then create your own Azure VM, and I did this, and we'll be working with Azure VMs that I did create. Use the new Azure VM commandlet. If you do need to prepare those using new Azure VM config and add Azure provisioning config commandlets. You'll want to add additional disk drives to your Azure VM, so you use the add Azure data disk commandlet to do that. And you're also going to need endpoints so you can communicate with that Azure VM, so you'll use add Azure endpoint for those options. Once you've got your Azure VM configured, then you'll use the start Azure VM to start it. And now, assuming this is a test system and not a production system, you'll want to shut it down when you're done testing, so you're not incurring the cost involved in running that Azure VM. And you stop it using stop Azure VM. The get Azure VM tells you all of your VMs and what their status is, whether they're running or they're stopped or they're getting, they're spinning up or whatever. When you do want to connect to your VM in a remote desktop manner, you use the get Azure remote desktop file commandlet with the service name and the name of the name of the server, and then I use the command line option launch, and that fires up the remote desktop environment into that Azure VM. It's a good idea, just to get your bearings straight to see what it looks like on there. But for the most part, you're going to want to use PowerShell remoting to manage that server. Now, we're going to want to connect to that Azure VM just like we connected to our domain servers and we connected to our non-domain server. You can add your Azure VM to your Active Directory domain if you provision the necessary linkages for the Azure VM to be able to see your domain controller and move the certificates from the Azure VM to your domain controller. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add the VM to my trusted hosts, just like I did for the non-domain server. My Azure VMs are not part of a domain, so I have to go through this. So I'm going to add it to the trusted hosts. Then I'm going to use a function that Michael Washam provided. Michael Washam was the program manager for the Azure product for Microsoft. He's now on his own, and I'll give you a link to his blog post where he provided this code. But what this does is it goes and looks at the Azure VM, gets the thumbprint of the certificate from that, and then adds that certificate to my local computer certificate store, and that will then allow me to connect via PowerShell remoting to that Azure VM. So let's go play. These are the two commands: set Azure subscription, and then I'm going to import Azure published settings files. This has the behind-the-scenes information that allows me to connect to my Azure VMs. I've already started them. If I just run get Azure VM, you can see that I have two Azure virtual machines, and they're both ready to go. I can use the get Azure remote desktop file commandlet, giving my service name and my VM name are both the same in both of these cases. So I'm going to just go ahead and launch, and it's going to ask me for my password. Hopefully the hotel internet isn't too slow. There it goes. And we have Windows Server 2012 R2. I can open up Management Studio here. Connect. And as you can see, I've got just one database, the Northwind database, up here in this Azure VM. I'm going to go ahead and disconnect, though, because we're here to talk about PowerShell remoting, not remote desktop. When I'm done, after we're done with this session, I will stop these Azure VMs so I don't have to pay for the time that I'm not using them. But as I mentioned before, I want to add the IP address to my trusted hosts so I'll have no issues communicating. It says it's going to modify that. Yep, that's good. I use the concatenate this time because I don't want to lose the trusted host for the the non-domain server that I was talking to before. Then I'm going to load this function into memory. I've put some comments here. It's just going to take the generated cert for that Azure VM and put it in my local certificate store on my local computer. And here's a link to the blog post that Michael did to when he wrote this code. So I'm going to go ahead and run that. I now have that function. I'm going to define a service name and a VM name. They're both going to be the same. And I'm going to execute the function using those values. And it comes back with a 0, and it didn't throw any errors. The 0 tells me essentially that it succeeded. The next thing I need to do is I need to use a commandlet called get Azure WinRM URI. So this gets the universal resource indicator for my Azure VM and stores it in this variable called $URI. If I just look and see what's in URI now as the result of that, you can see that here my absolute URI is the same as my original string, but it's the full path, including port number, for my Azure VM. I'm going to get the credential for my administrative account. And then I'm going to go ahead and enter a PowerShell session. Now again, we're going out to the cloud, so there's a little bit of connection delay here. And there we are. I can now navigate just like I did before. I can say import PS module. And if I create a persistent session, I only have to do this once, and I have all of the resources I need for managing SQL Server via PowerShell at my fingertips. I can now change directory to SQL, VM SQL 01, default. And I won't hit enter 37 times like I did the last time, just because I was impatient. But we now expect this. And I found the SQL Server provider to be a little bit slow at times like this, but in general, it's highly useful. But I do get impatient. There we go. All right, now I'm going to reinstantiate SVR as this one now, and it's get item dot and then BDIR. Set location to $BDIR. And now we're in where the backups are located for our Azure VM. If we look in there, again, earlier today, I created a backup of the Northwind database I have there. I did not change the time settings of my Azure VM, so it defaults to UTC time. So the UTC time, it's the 10th of September at 4:54 a.m. Go ahead and exit this session. Again, this was an ad hoc session. Normally, you'd be best served by using a persistent session. But now I can run my scripts against my Azure VM just like I ran my scripts against my domain servers and my non-domain servers. It's the same scripts. You manage SQL Server the exact same way. I want to see what kind of disk space I have out there. I have 2 drives because Azure always provides that temporary storage drive, and they tell you don't use it. It's for internal use only. So, but I do see how much space I have on the C drive. Here I can get the database information from that server that's out there. And you can see I have master, model, MSDB, Northwind, and TempDB. Now if I had added disks and had moved things around properly, you'd have seen that. And one last, run my scan error log script to see what kind of errors. And again, I tried to log in and tried to connect to the database called Fred, and Fred didn't exist, so it threw an error. So you can see that this particular script allows me to quickly scan through and look for the errors that I have on my SQL Server and filters out all the stuff that I really don't need to look at right now. So so hopefully you're seeing how easy it is to manage Azure databases in much the same way that you're already doing with your own session, with your own in-house databases, on-premises databases. This is just a set of basically the same code we've just been looking at. So I think that I'm not going to waste your time with that. We've already run through those examples a number of times. I just wanted to get them out there so you could see them. Okay. So just for some background, I've got some references here. Secrets of PowerShell Remoting. This is a great book to get you to understand some of the nuances of setting up remoting in a variety of environments, both domain, non-domain. They don't go into the Azure stuff, but hopefully I've helped you see how relatively easy that is. That's a free book. Go to PowerShellBooks.com and you can download that. It's a PDF. And that will help you understand remoting. There's a set of articles that I wrote using remoting to manage SQL servers efficiently. That will help you with some of the questions you might have on remoting. I highly recommend the book Learn Windows PowerShell 3 in a Month of Lunches, second edition by Don Jones and Jeffrey Hicks. This book, it's a really great beginner's book, but it's also a really great book for you if you've been doing PowerShell for a while, because it just explains things in such a simple manner that when you're trying to get something done and you can't remember exactly how to do it, it's a great resource for solving that problem. So pick up that book, go through the examples. In fact, I referenced this book earlier today myself. So also, here's a link to the blog post that Mike Washam did on the PowerShell updates that included that function that I used to load the certificate into my local computer store. It just made the process so much easier. And finally, there's a link here on upsearch.com, manage both on-prem and Azure databases with PowerShell. That has this slide deck and the demo script already there for you. You can download that now. So, all right, Michael, I'm essentially done. If we have now time for any questions that anyone might have. I'm sorry, Martin.
Right. That's okay, Alan. Can't see any questions come through at the moment, but I've just got one of my own, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Well, I've never actually got an Azure virtual machine before. In terms of getting one, is there much cost involved?
I have an advantage in that I have an MSDN subscription, and as part of that MSDN subscription, I get $150 credit each month towards my use of Azure, the Azure environment. So, and also when I'm not using the Azure VMs, I shut them down, which I'll be doing. In fact, I'm going to do that right now while I'm thinking about it, so I don't even have, I just go ahead and I have the code here in my script, and I just go ahead and stop them.
Okay, so I guess that's a tip for anyone using this to shut the machines down while you're not using them?
If they're not production machines, yes, you want to shut them down, because otherwise the clock is ticking.
Right. Okay, that's great. So I guess if you've already got an MSDN subscription, you're good to go.
Yes, and otherwise they have different costs based on the size and power and provisioning of the Azure VM. So the more resources you use, the more it costs. But if you go to azure.microsoft.com, it will explain all that for you.
Okay, that's great, Alan. Thanks a lot.
Sure. Anything else?
I've not seen any questions come through. There's still people on the line, but no questions coming through.
All right. Well, let me go back to the slide deck, because we do want to let you know that I will be presenting an expanded version of this. I'll put together some additional demos and some additional information to fill a full 75 minutes on this presentation at the PASS Summit. So you can use the 24HOP14 discount code to save $200 on your Summit registration fee. And next, Julie Cosmarno is going to talk about data visualization with PowerView. So if there aren't any questions, I'm ready to move on.
Okay, thanks a lot for the time, Alan. That was great. On behalf of all the audience members, I'd like to thank you, and hopefully we'll see you at PASS.
Great. Thank you so much.